Welcome to Glory Days. I'm Nick Brookes and today we're going to be talking UFC. So, even if you don't know the difference between an armbar and an arm punch, you'll surely be aware that the Ultimate Fighting Championship is big business. But it wasn't always this way. When the UFC got started 31 years ago, it had an underground, fight club feel. Let's take a look at how it transitioned from fringe to mainstream, from freak show to money spinner. To understand the birth of the UFC, we first have to talk about the Gracie family. George Gracie arrived in northeastern Brazil from Scotland in 1801. By the early 1900s, his grandson Gastão had become a prominent figure in the city of Belém. One day, Gastão saw a Japanese judoka at the city's American circus. Impressed, he arranged for him to begin training his son Carlos. Carlos passed on the lessons to his brothers. Unbound by the strict conventions which govern judo in Japan, the Gracies modified the teachings to suit their needs. In 1925, they moved to Rio and opened the first Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy. At this stage, Carlos struck on a brilliant marketing ploy. He put an ad out in local newspapers, inviting all comers to take on the Gracie Challenge to see if they could best the slender young man in a no-holds-barred contest. Supposedly the wording read, "If you want a broken arm, call me." The Gracies called their new martial art Vale Tudo, an early forerunner of MMA which literally translates to anything goes. The brothers would take on all comers. Almost always they were outsized, yet they inevitably emerged victorious. The spectacles grew popular in Brazil. Before long, they were fighting in football stadiums. And when Carlos's grandson Horian moved to California in the 80s, he updated the Gracie Challenge, offering $100,000 if anyone could beat him in a Vale Tudo match. The Gracie legend was taking flight. Still, the UFC would never have got going without Art Davie. An advertising executive from Brooklyn, Davie dreamed of starting his own no-holds-barred tournament. And when he read about Horian Gracie in Playboy, he knew he'd found just the guy. But Horian wasn't especially interested in Davie's idea. Unperturbed, he started rolling at the Gracie gym every week, earning Horian's trust when he used his marketing chops to sell a boatload of the family's training videos. Davie had his man. Gracie brought name recognition to the venture, but the road ahead was far from clear. Davie quit his job so he could give all to the UFC, but he'd have a tough time finding a broadcaster, fighters to compete, even a name for this thing. At one point, the crew tried to recruit Chuck Norris to act as a commentator, but when they approached him, Norris just kept shaking his head, incredulously asking, "Is this legal?" over and over again. But slowly, things started to fall into place. Davie found his fighters. Royce, Horian's unassuming little brother, would represent the Gracie family. Ken Shamrock was a shoot fighter who'd made his name wrestling in Japan. Pat Smith, a karate black belt who claimed a 250-0 amateur kickboxing record. In Taylor Tooley, he found a 410-pound Hawaiian who'd had success as a sumo, at least until he'd been kicked out for throwing a reporter through a glass wall. Gerard Gordeau was a mean Dutch kickboxer who moonlighted as muscle for some of Amsterdam's less salubrious businesses. Davie's budget wouldn't stretch far enough for a big boxing star, but he managed to bag Art Jimmerson, a top 10 cruiserweight riding a 15-fight win streak. Rounding out the 8-man bracket was Zane Frazier and Kevin Rozier, two big dudes who'd both been heavyweight kickboxing champs. There was diversity here, if not quite the name value Davie had hoped for. And Gracie aside, each of these men looked mean. Naturally, the big boys of the broadcasting world showed no interest in the product. But Davie managed to get a bite from SEG, a pay-per-view service that had had success screening live comedy and pop concerts. And with a down payment of $4,000, he secured the McNichols Arena, then home of the Denver Nuggets. Still, there were issues to iron out. A boxing ring would be no good for grappling, so Davie spitballed ideas involving electric fences, a giant perspex cube, and a moat filled with sharks and piranhas. These were all abandoned in favour of the cage-style octagon, but it was clear from the start that UFC would be anything but subtle. Although the rule list was short, it still had to be written. The team decided on 5-minute rounds, on fights that could end only by knockout, submission, or the corner throwing in the towel. Eye gouging, groin shots and biting were off limits. Only the ringside doctor, not the referee, had license to stop the fights. With that said, UFC 1 was locked in for Friday the 12th of November, 1993. Of course, fight week wouldn't be all smooth sailing. When Kevin Rosier arrived at the airport, he was so out of shape that Art Davey greeted him with a rhetorical question. What the fuck happened to 265 pounds? All 8 fighters were booked into a hotel with a tiny lobby, and during the course of the week it looked like a number of brawls might erupt before the cameras started rolling. Thule announced he'd arrived in Denver without any shorts, and finding a pair to fit his 60-inch waist proved impossible. He'd take to the stage in a patterned skirt. Jimmerson had no boxing boots, so had to wear running shoes, and most worryingly, come fight day, the contract between Davey and SEG still hadn't been signed. As the hours wound down, there was a growing prospect this thing wouldn't be shown on TV at all. The two sides eventually struck a deal to broadcast UFC 1 at 5:43 p.m. 77 minutes later, the lights went up. It was time. The arena was full of tension. Local ticket promoters had billed the event as the most violent clash since the Romans pitted lions against the Christians. That ensured there'd be 4,000 butts in seats, yet it felt like there wasn't a single cerebral martial arts student in the house. This was a just bleed crowd. Even commentator Jim Brown said he was kind of worried about them. Surely everyone inside the McNichols carried some concerns. No one had a clue how this would look. The first quarterfinal confirmed the UFC's freak show quality, yet the 26 seconds the fight lasted showed this was no child-friendly circus. In one corner stood Thule, the 400-pound skirted sumo. In the other was Gerard Gordeau, a lean 6'5" skinhead who looked like an extra from a prison movie. Thule tried to wrestle, but was quickly felled by a volley of punches. Then it happened, the moment that would come to epitomise the UFC's brutality, a blood-curdling scene that seemed to belong to a street fight from hell. With the giant Hawaiian slumped against the cage, Gordeau stepped back and threw his full weight into a swinging kick. It hit Thule, who'd opted not to wear a mouthguard, like a lead pipe to the face. Teeth were dislodged. One went flying past the sponsors from Gold's Gym, who decided then and there they wanted nothing more to do with the UFC. Even the ref seemed sickened by the brutality of the moment. He stepped in to stop the contest. The first UFC fight was over. The crowd went wild, but backstage there was a different energy, the kind of sober, ghostly silence you'd expect from soldiers about to enter battle. Apparently Art Jimmerson's manager rushed back from cageside crying. No doubt a number of fighters were suddenly wondering why they were there. But it was too late to walk away now. The second fight pitted Zane Frazier against Kevin Rosier. Rosier collided with a light installation en route to the cage. When the fight got going, it looked less like two elite athletes and more like a pair of drunks in a car park. A knee to the groin seemed to turn the slugfest in Frazier's favour, but he punched himself out. Eventually, Rosier brought him down and finished the fight with a horrible stomp. From there, the fights got stranger. Art Jimmerson had arrived in Denver, confident of taking home the $50,000 prize. But he soon realised he wasn't fully prepared for this brutal new challenge. Bizarrely, he opted to enter the cage wearing a single boxing glove, presumably thinking it would allow him to jab and grapple. His opponent, Royce Gracie, at 175 pounds, the most unassuming of the competitors, sported the kind of gi more commonly seen in the kids' judo class. Within a minute, he'd taken Jimmerson down, drowning on his back. The boxer tapped out before Royce could attempt a submission. Shamrock quickly submitted Smith to round out the quarterfinals. Although the crowd didn't seem overly enamoured with the grappling masterclasses, the first 4 fights had largely gone off without a hitch. Only now the winners would have to fight again, and the first semi-finalists wore more than a little damage. Rosier had badly bruised his eye. Gordeau had broken his hand on Thule's bowling ball of a cranium and had bits of the Hawaiian's teeth embedded in his foot. Still, both fighters were game. Back in the octagon, Gordeau quickly finished Rosier with a series of crushing leg kicks. In the second semi, Gracie tapped Shamrock with a rear naked choke. The final was all set, Dutch kickboxing versus Brazilian jiu-jitsu. But there was another problem. Going into fight night, Art Davey had no idea how long the event would last. Some early Gracie fights had gone on for hours, and SEG had made it clear that the broadcast couldn't exceed 170 minutes. Many of the rules he'd put in place were designed to keep contests short, yet unexpectedly, the UFC now faced the opposite problem. None of the fights had made it out of the first round. Combined, all 6 had lasted less than 11 minutes. Clearly, the commentators were struggling to fill time, and the 2 remaining fighters needed a moment to catch their breath before the final. Thankfully, Davey had booked 2 alternates, reserves who could step in at short notice. Now he arranged a last-minute fight between the pair, promising each $1,000 and a shot of appearing on the next UFC card. That ensured Gracie and Gordeau a little rest before the final. Once they were inside the cage, viewers were reminded that the UFC was well removed from the disciplined world of traditional martial arts. Gracie quickly secured the takedown. Frustrated, Gordeau sunk his teeth into his opponent's skin. Royce wasn't going to let that go. He replied with a pair of headbutts. Once the choke was in tight, he clung on to Gordeau well after the tap. When he finally let go, he wore a look of fury. He should have been ecstatic. By far the smallest fighter, the one who any casual fan would have dismissed, he'd won the tournament without breaking a sweat. What's more, the Gracie name had emerged from the UFC enhanced. Today, anyone even vaguely acquainted with fight sports has heard of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Of course, the event hadn't been without wrinkles. Stripped down to 4,000 seats, McNichols Arena had a small hall feel. The production looked amateur, and the commentators were either bland, clueless, or baffled. And with no internet, let alone social media, Davey couldn't be sure whether the event had been a success. He'd have to wait for the pay-per-view numbers. Still, the masked ball held the next night had a celebratory feel. The tension which had bubbled between fighters all week disappeared. In its place was a camaraderie, a sense of brotherhood. The toothless Thule tore up the dance floor. At one point, a number of fighters joined a conga line. Art Davey must have breathed a serious sigh of relief. This off-the-wall, anything-could-happen fight club he'd cooked up had worked. Hadn't it? The pay-per-view numbers came in, revealing that UFC 1 had done a shade over 86,000 buys. For a fringe event, offering a still unnamed sport and operating on a tiny budget, that was a resounding success. Davey & Co had certainly made money, and by UFC 5 they more than tripled their pay-per-view audience. But more prominence brought greater scrutiny. In 1996, Senator John McCain saw footage from early UFCs and felt compelled to stop this barbaric new spectacle. He wrote to all 50 state governors, pleading with them to ban the sport. 36 complied, and most cable pay-per-view distributors dropped the UFC. While that hurt the UFC in the short term, it forced the sport to evolve and led to the introduction of the standardized rules we see today. By the time UFC 21 took place in July 1999, modern MMA had taken flight. From then on, the UFC's rise has been steepling. In January 2001, the Fertitta brothers bought the organization for $2 million. When they came to sell in 2016, the UFC carried a $4 billion price tag. Today, many fans would tell you MMA has surpassed boxing as the most popular and most watched fight sport. Could anyone have imagined that when it started out 31 years ago? Was UFC 1 the strangest event to shape the sporting landscape? Drop me a line and tell me your thoughts.